Aphiemi means to let it alone, let it be, or forgive.
But I think that's actually a really helpful thing to talk about in homiletics too. Like when you're preaching, using stories from your own personal life or your own direct context is really important.
He says it symbolizes God's relationship with humanity before the law came, secondly, under the law, and thirdly, under grace. Figs and grapes represented prosperity and peace.
Mm-hmm. Welcome to the Impact Nations podcast with Steve Stewart. My name is Tim. I am your host, and this is Season 9, Episode 7, The Mercy Judgment Edge. All right, I have got my tea. I brought in a very large jug of water in case I get thirsty. So, and I have my iPad. I'm ready. Let's do this thing. What are we talking about?
We're going to talk about figs.
Oh, I was hoping you would say that.
Yeah, no, I had an incredibly mushy fig in Canada 2 weeks ago.
I've never not had a mushy fig.
Yeah,
Is there such a thing?
I just
Are they
don't know.
all just overripe?
They must be. I think they come that way.
So
what we're really going to do
Yeah.
is talk about the parable of the fig tree.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to take it in a little bit bigger context, and we'll compare it with the prophetic action that Jesus did in Matthew and in Mark with the when he cursed the fig tree.
Yeah, because the fig comes up a few times, not just in direct parables, but also just in the narrative. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, good, okay.
Okay, so I just want to review a little bit on this parables thing. Parables are not really intended to give us information. They're more intended to cause us to ask new questions, to consider new possibilities, and maybe even change our point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, they can challenge our assumptions. They often contain a depth of meaning and therefore a variety of interpretations. That's been thematic for us for probably 3 years.
Yeah.
Right? There's the literal, the moral, and the water to wine.
Yeah.
But the thing about it is, we in the West, we've been, both in the church and outside of the church, we've been so influenced by the Enlightenment and reason that we read everything to get information.
Yeah.
I want to know what the right answer is. And parables just challenge us. They're not about right answer. They're about mystery. And I think it's pretty important that we remember that even today as we start to look at the parable of fig tree. I started just in that Luke 13 fig tree, and then I got thinking more and more about how significant figs are. In fact, I looked it up. There are 260 references to figs in the Bible.
Wow.
That's, I think it's 178 for grapes, vineyards. So it's even bigger than that.
They liked their figs.
Yeah, they did. So we're going to look first of all at the fig or the fig tree, really, as a symbol that runs throughout the Old Testament. They are the central image, along with grapes and I would say and olives are they're the central image throughout the Old Testament for the nation of Israel. They're often referred to in terms of our individual lives, and that isn't a surprise because Israel was totally an agrarian society.
Right, and that's what they grow there. I mean, if it had been taking place in a different time in a different place, probably just a different fruit would have been featured. I mean, if Jesus had grown up in the Philippines, maybe we'd be talking about durian trees instead.
Or flipping the coin the other way, maybe he could have grown up in Turkey, which is the number one exporter of figs in the world.
That's good to know.
Wanted to fit that in.
I feel like we're going to get a few tidbits on figs today that people really need to know.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say they might. But what's important is to see that symbols come out of what surrounds us.
Yeah.
Right? If it's some obscure thing, it's not a very powerful symbol. And figs and grapes and vineyards, and olives were right at the center of their life.
Sorry, just going to go
Yeah.
down a total rabbit trail
Sure.
here, but I think that's actually a really helpful thing to talk about in homiletics too. Like when you're preaching, using stories from your own personal life or your own direct context is really important. Like if you're trying to share a story that you didn't live through or something like that, it falls flat.
It does.
You've got to draw from what you personally know and from what your audience knows.
And common experience too.
Yeah.
That's what's the strongest, I think. So fig trees are presented both positively and negatively in the Old Testament. I'm going to give just a few examples because there's so many verses. But in a positive way, both figs and grapes represented prosperity and peace. I just suddenly thought of this, I think yesterday. When Moses sent the 12 spies out, what's the land like? What did they come back with?
That giant cluster of grapes.
And figs.
And figs?
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
Figs are mentioned more, and yet I don't know, grapes just seem to always get
Oh, yeah, because
billing.
they had the big cluster. Yeah. And, you don't get clusters of figs because they're mushy.
It would have been a different story.
We got to move on. Give you a couple of examples. One, Hosea 9, verse 10, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first fruits on the fig tree in its first season. And then one of my actual favorite verses in the Old Testament is Micah 4:4, which is paralleled in Isaiah 2. But it's this. It gives us a great example because I said figs represented positively both prosperity but also peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares. Have we ever heard that before? And their spears into pruning forks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall all sit under their own vines and under their own fig trees, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. I mean, we could talk about that instead all morning. But it's really...
It's messianic, isn't it? I mean, it's looking forward to a new kingdom.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
you just beat me to it. That's what I was going to say. It is a messianic symbol. And, under the tree, I've shared elsewhere, I've written about Isaiah 65, one of the messianic visions. Again, they're under the tree cultivating. But it also serves as a negative symbol. And we're going to be confronted both positively and negatively today in the New Testament, by the way. Often Israel's faithlessness and wickedness led to punishment that's reflected in destruction of the fig tree. Jonah 1:7, he has laid, this is the Lord speaking, he, Israel, has laid waste my vine and ruined my fig tree. Or a classic is Micah 7, 1 and 2. Woe is me, for I have become like one who after the summer fruit has been gathered and the vintage has been gleaned, finds no cluster to eat. There is no first ripe fig for which I hunger. So you've got the first one, Jonah is God's perspective, and then you got Micah's. There's consequence to this. And when he talks about fruitlessness or lack of fruit, really referring to Israel missing its calling, because its calling goes back to its origin, Genesis 12, to be a blessing to all the peoples, the ethnos of the world. Yeah. So that's at the heart of it. It's failing to, Micah 6:8, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. It's as though the fig tree in the Old Testament was a barometer. It's like a measurement of the image of it, of measuring the health of Israel. It was either flourishing or it reflected Israel's exile as punishment. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
As I started to look closely at the fig in preparation for this, I saw how many times the Lord refers to that. Well, let's get to where we'll spend most of our time, the parable. But I want to consider about 6 or 7 issues, and we look at this parable. I want to consider the relationship between this parable and the cursing of the fig tree that happens in Matthew 21. At one level, the only connection between this one and the Matthew one is the mention of a fig tree. But I think what they really are, I think they are about two different oral traditions. Luke was written after Matthew, after Mark, which was the original source for this. And I think that Luke's tradition was a story. And that was part of the oral tradition. People that traveled, therefore, with Paul, because Luke and Paul were together, they heard this in terms of a story that Jesus told. And the one in Matthew and Mark where he curses, it's an action parable, right? It's like when Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple.
Sure, yeah. It's something that actually happened. It's not a fable, if you will.
Yeah.
This has actually happened, and yet Jesus is taking action to make a larger point.
Which makes it very parabolic. Both deal with a lack of fruit, but they go two different directions here, because I will get into it a little bit later. But in the Matthew, Mark tradition, Jesus just curses it and it withers.
Yeah,
it's like, okay, the time's here. Whereas in Luke, there's a warning: destruction's coming unless. And so there's something where there's more leniency. Judgment in Luke's parable, which is what we're talking about right now, it's like judgment isn't ignored, but it's delayed, it's suspended.
As in there's still time?
There's still time.
Still time to change your ways, change your mind.
And what is that suspension? It's grace, right? It's grace. There's also interesting, a few weeks ago, we talked to you and I about the parable of the wheat and the tares. And what's the parallel between this story and that one? In both cases, there was obvious failing. Remember, the farmers come and say, there's weeds in there, let's pull them out, because we can't have weeds in the crop. He says, no, let's wait.
Wait until it's time to harvest.
Here, when the owner says, let's just get rid of that thing, it's just wasting nutrients. It's the vine dresser is what they call it, but it's like the manager says, no, let's wait and let's see what happens. So I just thought that was interesting that there was that parallel, that connection. Okay, here's the second thing I want to consider. Very simple. Who's Jesus telling the parable to? Originally, he was addressing not just the leaders, but the crowd, the Jewish people. But I want to say again what we've said earlier. These are stories about stories. In other words, Jesus told a story, and a generation later, they were written down according to the oral tradition and according to the selection of the gospel writers.
Sure, because Luke's trying to make a larger point.
Yeah.
Even in terms of we've talked about the order in which they write these things, that might be different depending on the gospel writer's overall target audience and overall objectives.
Yeah. Luke is right in the middle, the Luke version. The Matthew-Mark version it's Holy Week. It's right at the climax of all the conflict and everything. So we always have to remember what was the author's purpose.
Yeah.
As we've said many times, but John says you couldn't write all this stuff down. There's too much. Okay, third thing to consider is a real interesting thing, and I came across this as I was doing some reading, and it got my mind going, and that is there a significance to where the fig tree was planted? Because when he told the parable, and I'm quoting from verse 6, a man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard. He planted a fig tree in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. That is interesting to me because it, at one level, doesn't seem central to the story, right?
Yeah.
This is about a fig tree, not about a vineyard. But fig trees and and vineyards were both symbols of blessing. We just said 10 minutes ago in the Old Testament. And remember, Tim, there's nothing casual about how the gospel writers put them together.
Yeah.
There's not a phrase that's wasted. And it's there for a reason. It was actually not uncommon for a fig tree to be planted in a vineyard in first century Palestine. But so what? You know, it's
Why
like,
bother
why
including
bother
that detail?
putting that in?
Yeah.
And so I went, But again, as I was reading and helped along, if the owner of the vineyard is in the first half of the parable, it's a very short parable, but not really in the second, because he passes it over to the vine dresser, the manager, the guy on the ground, right? We've got managers with our Thrive Gardens. They're
Sure.
the ones on the ground.
Yeah. Who are walking through that garden every
Yeah,
single
we're
day.
behind the scenes. Our partners are behind the scenes, but the gardener's there. So the story shifts to the gardener, to the vine dresser. So why did he mention it? Well, that vine dresser, that gardener, was full-time. That was his job.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if that was his job, that tells me that likely this was a very successful vineyard, which tells me likely the owner was successful. So he's already got this great prosperous business.
And you're saying it's successful because we can draw that conclusion because he's got a full-time.
He's got a full-time
manager.
guy.
Yeah, it's like somebody who's got a side gig. They work a full-time job and then they go and are starting their own small business. That's not quite a successful business yet.
No.
But as soon as you've got employees that are working
got
full-time,
employees.
you've got a happening thing.
So that's interesting to me. And if his vineyard's prosperous enough, why did he plant a fig tree? Not a grove of fig trees. He planted a fig tree. Why? Well, maybe it's because he just took pleasure from it. You know, Christina has loved gardening. Before we had kids, she's always loved gardening. We come back from a trip, first thing, man, I can't get the luggage out of the car. And she's checking on the garden. Why? Because she just takes pleasure from it, right? So maybe there's a water to wine meaning here for us in this parable, that the owner he takes great pleasure. Maybe what we're saying is God's creation is there for his pleasure. And delight is at the center of the world, of the cosmos.
Yeah.
His delight is at the center of his creation. That's sort of water to winey, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot there because I think we need to continue to come back to that in terms of we are his delight. He delights in us. And I think sometimes there's too often we slide into a gospel where actually he's pretty cranky with us and he didn't, he regrets making us or whatever it is. Or we get into we exist to give him glory, which we do want to give him glory. And we exist to care for his creation, but we also exist just because he delights in us and he wanted to delight in us.
Yeah.
I mean, now we're getting right down to the why do we exist sort of a thing, but I think if we ignore his delight, it's at our peril.
Yeah.
And it can affect the way we declare the gospel.
And frankly, if we live aware of his delight, it impacts the way we live, the way we think, the way we see everything around us. So right from the beginning, his delight, his pleasure, the fig tree owner's pleasure permeated his creation. So therefore, and this is contrary to what many of us heard, grace isn't an afterthought. Grace isn't a fix-it for the sin in the world. Grace isn't a fix-it for your sins and my sins. Grace and love are not something that he bestows on us. They are who he is.
It's his very nature.
It's his nature.
It's not plan B.
No, it's who he is.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge part of what Jesus is trying to do through his whole ministry.
Yeah.
This is who your papa really is.
Yeah.
So Can we move on here to another issue to think of? Is what's the context for this story, which is Luke 13, 6-9. But I want to give you the 5 verses beforehand. Verse 1 to 5. There were present at that season some who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate, interesting, Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. See, it's not just like that poor guy in the praetorium washing his hands. I got cornered into this. I didn't want to do this.
A bit of a pass, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe, huh? So they told him about Pilate mingling the blood of the Galileans with their sacrifices. And Jesus, that's what they said. They told him, what about that? And Jesus answered and said to them, do you suppose that these Galileans were worse sinners than all other Galileans because they suffered such things? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, turn, change your way, you will all likewise perish. See that all word? Mm-hmm. And then instead of dropping it there, he gives them, by the way, here's another example, just in case you need another one. Yeah. Or those 18 on whom the Tower of Siloam fell and killed them. Do you think that you were worse sinners than all other men who dwelt in Jerusalem? I tell you, no, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. By the way, just an hour and a half ago, as I was just taking my eyes away from my screen, I saw an article about Siloam, because it is a Palestinian community right by Jerusalem. Yeah. And it was a very interesting article. But
I'm always interested when we get in the Gospels a little bit of these kind of current events mentions. We don't get a lot of them, but these things that just remind you, like, yeah, this was just real world stuff. These guys were like just like us. They had political events. They had huge events that were known around the known world at that time. And I think this is one of those little sections of Luke that I often come back to, because I think Luke actually often has Jesus warning them, like, hey, you can't keep going down this path politically. In terms of your political rebellion against Rome, it's not going to end well. And I think sometimes we may misinterpret some of those things as wrath, God's wrath, the ultimate, wrath that's coming, versus him warning about just, no, in your current event is really interesting. Again, these are current events, and Jesus' warnings are about what is going down right now in these political times.
That's so true. That's so true. And we're going to see that theme keeps happening today. So this parable reveals the grace of God. I just talked about that. But the context of these 5 verses is clearly a warning. We can't whitewash that. Yeah. It's a warning. Sin carries consequences. He says, unless you repent, unless you change your way, you will all likewise perish. So within the context of the nation, Jesus is, and he's going to continue right through the Gospels, warning them that they need to change what you just said, or suffer severe consequences. And the fall of Jerusalem is coming in AD 70, right?
Yeah.
Luke's written this after the fall of Jerusalem, but Jesus said it.
Jesus is predicting it. Luke's got the benefit of hindsight to go, oh, that's exactly what he was pointing to.
Yeah. Huh. And isn't it interesting what's happening here? The people bring that up, and I think they're trying to get Jesus to respond to this Roman atrocity. So they'll get worked up.
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. That's taken place, but he refuses.
Yeah.
As I said, instead he just goes on, well, let me give you another example,
Yeah.
So I think by saying, and, did the tower fall on them because they were worse sinners, the Galileans because they were worse sinners? Jesus is saying something really, really important. They were not guilty of greater sin.
Yeah.
That's not why these catastrophes happen. And this hits us in our North American context, especially evangelical context. Whenever there's a Hurricane Kate or there's an earthquake, immediately we project that to the angry God that they think we have, And this is judgment. If you do this, he's going to do that.
I recall the phrase "chickens coming home to roost" in a political season 15 years ago or so. And that's the sentiment is, you angered God, and so now here's the consequences.
Yeah, now you're going to get it. Yeah.
And Jesus seems to be implying
Absolutely
not at
saying,
all the
no,
case.
no.
What do you think? What do you make of these two juxtaposed against each other? Because the thing with Pilate, that incident, I mean, that's just political retribution. It's Pilate getting grumpy and trying to exert his dominance over this people and make sure that Caesar sees that no, I've got control here. And he's responding to rebellion, clearly political rebellion.
Yep.
But then. Sorry. So that means that in one sense they did get what's coming to them, but I think Jesus is, or we're being pointed to by Luke. There are consequences to our behavior in terms of if you behave a certain way, things are going to come back at you, and that's not even God. I mean, now we're right back to what we've talked about before in terms of wrath being just the natural consequence of the sin that God eventually just hands off and says, if you want to keep going that direction, those are the natural consequences. But then the second one is this natural disaster sort of a thing. Some bad architecture, bad engineering, and a tower falls down on him. It's an interesting juxtaposition. What do you make of that?
I think he's dealing with because socio-political issues are not new to God, or they've always been there.
Yeah.
And the religious mindset can so easily say, this is who we need to line up with against this or for that.
Yeah.
And he's saying no. And the second thing that's almost universal is bad stuff happens as punishment. I will never forget, I was in Nicaragua. We were doing food and helping because there was a terrible hurricane had come through. And we went into this next town. We drove forever, got to the town. We were giving out food, and I saw all these people. They looked so sad, and their place was flooded. And I said something like, it was a whole group while the food was being done, something like, why do you think this happened? And I was thinking in terms of natural, we didn't have, and universally, because we've sinned, God is mad at us. Yeah. Absolutely universal.
What's your response to that in the moment?
No, he isn't.
Yeah.
He always, always loves you. We're in a fallen world. There are consequences. There are calamities. But no, he loves you. So that's just the universal response. So Jesus is dealing directly with that. He is speaking straight into the idea of retributive justice from God. There's nothing retributive. Sin, as you went ahead of me, and it's good because this is where today's teaching is going. Sin does have serious, serious consequences. But sin is it releases the power and the demonic force that brings about these things. It's not an angry God. Jesus is clearly warning that destruction is coming to Israel if it does not change its ways. He intends this to also apply to each individual, our individual choices, when they are sinful, when they are all the things that they come out of less than a good motivation, they will be destructive to us. So I just want to say that as much as I'm so happy to have discovered so much grace in this parable, but I can't ignore that Luke structured it. These two things go together.
Yeah.
Really 1 to 9 are a unit, although we're doing it as 2. Okay. In both of these passages, there's a disaster, a crisis, but in the second half, in the story, the crisis is pushed back for a time. Not permanently, but for a time. Let's talk about allegory a little bit, since that's a theme through this whole parable series. And this particular parable has been subject to a ton of allegorizing. And I decided not to take the time to show you all the different things. But I'll give you one little one. St. Augustine, he said the 3 years that the tree had been in, which, by the way, is practical. A fig tree takes 3 years to bear fruit. But he's saying symbolically, allegorically, he says it symbolizes God's relationship with humanity before the law came, secondly, under the law, and thirdly, under grace when Christ came. It clearly points out the history of the fig tree representing in Israel. You can't get away from that. There's that allegorical thing, the fig tree in Israel.
Do you think that his audience would have got that right away?
Yes.
When they hear him telling a story about a fig tree, they're like, "Oh,
Yes.
he's talking about us." Isn't
Yes.
he? Yeah.
I read years ago, I don't know the source anymore, that the fig tree was not only representative of Israel, but the political, as it were, the political Israel.
Okay.
The material Israel. But absolutely they would have. And that's a good point. But I did check into that, and it would have all been understood because of the 260 references,
Sure.
So therefore, the parable does depict failure of the nation in its relationship with God. But one thing I don't believe, and a lot of commentators don't agree with me, and what do you know if you do? I do not think it's helpful to see this as a dialogue between the owner being the Father God, and the gardener, the vine dresser, being Jesus. I don't really think that's because if we look at it that way, then what we have is God the Father, the wrath of God wanting to be poured out in Jesus is, as Bradley says, is the asbestos suit.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, trying to protect us from
Trying to
his wrath.
protect us.
Yeah,
So
get in the way.
I don't think so. But it's certainly Christ is in this one. Not only did he tell it, but the vine dresser, I think what's happening here is it points to the compassion of the triune God. Okay?
Yeah.
I just don't like this divisiveness, which, by the way, again, in very many of the conservative commentaries, they say, yeah, this is God, but the Father, but Jesus protects us, and I don't think it's true.
No, this is totally wackadoodle, and I haven't actually read the direct text yet for today's thing, so it may not work at all. But is it possible, like in John's Gospel, Jesus said, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy.
Yep.
And we have talked before in this space regarding sometimes we give the attributes of the enemy to God.
Yes.
Is it possible that actually really the enemy is like, all right, I'm gonna take these people out. It's my turn, and Jesus says, "Hold your horses."
I'm going to get to that in a moment too.
Man, I keep getting ahead of you. I'm sorry,
but no, it's
I haven't
good.
read your notes. So.
It's good. It's good.
I like the surprise.
Yeah,
but I keep ruining the surprise.
So then here's a big issue: is this parable primarily about grace and delay, or is it mainly about the seriousness of the present situation? Which is it? The answer is yes. All of Jesus' ministry walks on this edge, doesn't it? It includes both grace and warning, his teaching, his actions. Yeah. He says, the kingdom is here, or in some translations, the time is at hand. Good news. Therefore, repent.
Yeah.
Right? So he's continually declaring both mercy and consequential judgment. And you talked a minute ago about consequential judgment. You and I were talking earlier today about divine consent.
Yeah.
Romans 1 classic. And he gave them over to their sin. It's the effects of our sin. If people can get one thing out of today, it is the effects of our sin that punishes us, not God. Yeah. And we quickly point, and either we've got an angry God or, well, we had it coming. It's our sin that does that.
Is the risk of taking that too literally, like sometimes calamity comes their way and they're instantly taking inventory of, okay, well, what have I done to bring this upon myself? Now, I think the underlying supposition is I've angered God.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, perhaps there is a positive analysis there of, hey, is my behavior leading to broken relationships? Or even damaged goods or what have you?
Or as you said earlier, and will develop, has my behavior opened the way to being influenced or my life being affected by that thief who comes to steal, kill, and destroy?
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. So, in the same chapter, as we're talking about this edge between, there is judgment, but there's grace and mercy. Just a little bit later in the same chapter, verses 34, 35, this one has stuck with me almost as soon as I came to Christ. He stands over the city. He's on the Mount of Olives. And he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wing, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate, and assuredly I say to you, you shall not see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." There's great care, great compassion. But again, I want to say in this parable, judgment, consequences are not canceled. They're postponed. Okay? Now, this mercy judgment edge has always been the nature of God's relation with Israel. It doesn't just start with Jesus. And as we've insisted here before, 1 John 4:8, John is love, period. God is love and love only. Yeah. He does not punish us with storms and with earthquakes, but our sin opens us up to the one the Bible calls the devourer, which is really just an Old Testament term. I just this second realized for the thief in John 10:10. Yeah. Let me give you one verse, Malachi 3:11. And this is the Lord speaking, I will rebuke the devourer for your sake, so that he will not destroy the fruit of your ground, nor shall the vine fail to bear fruit for you in the field. The devourer has one thing he wants to do, and God holds him back. Yeah. Now, I didn't notice when we started.
I didn't either, but I'm having a good time.
We're all right?
I'm
okay. Because I want to give you a wonderful, wonderful passage called the Song of the Vineyard. It's Isaiah 5, 1-7. And like lots of folks, I've loved it for years. As you know, I was a vineyard pastor for years. The vineyard was named out of this passage. But I wanted to finish this section because it shows this walking on the edge, right? The grace, the mercy, but also consequences. So, starting at verse 1, now I will sing for the one I love. Isn't this beautiful? This is the Lord. Now I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a rich and fertile hill. We started today with being in a vineyard, didn't we? Yeah. He plowed the land, cleared the stones, planted it with the best vines. In the middle, he built a watchtower and carved a winepress in the nearby rock. Then he waited for a harvest of sweet grapes. But the grapes that grew were bitter. Now, you people of Jerusalem and Judah, you judge between me and my vineyard. Now, listen to this. Is this the sound of the wrath of God? What more could I have done for my vineyard that I have not already done? When I expected sweet grapes, why did my vineyard give me bitter grapes? Now I will tell you what I will do. Divine consent to my vineyard. And I underlined two phrases I just realized. I want you to think of that in terms of I will rebuke the devourer. Okay?
Okay.
So I will tell you what I'll do to my vineyard. I will tear down its hedges and let it be destroyed. I will break down its walls and let the animals trample it. Not I will destroy it, I will trample it.
I'm going to, the divine consent, it's right there. Wow.
Where the vines are not pruned and the ground is not hoed, a place overgrown with briars and thorns, I will command the clouds to drop no rain on it. The nation of Israel is the vineyard of the Lord of heaven's armies. The people of Judah are his pleasant garden. He expected a crop of justice, but instead he found oppression. He expected to find righteousness, but instead he heard cries of violence. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. I want to just in those last couple of phrases, the juxtaposition, he expected justice and found oppression.
Yeah.
He wanted to find righteousness, but instead found violence.
Yeah.
These are the things he cares about.
Yeah.
We are to be pursuing justice.
He cares about it right now.
Yeah,
huh?
yeah. And righteousness juxtaposed against violence. So we need to be careful. We're not just not just piety, but rather peacemakers.
Yes.
Blessed are those who are the peacemakers.
Peacemakers. They shall be called the sons of God.
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
Okay, can we go to the seventh thing from this one parable?
Yeah.
Parables, only 4 verses. Quite a bit here, huh? Jesus introduces the vine dresser. We talked about that.
Yeah.
And he becomes the source of the decision about what's going to happen to the tree. He does.
Yeah.
So why did he do this, the owner? Let's look at these verses. So he said to the man working the vineyard, see here, for 3 years I've come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting the soil? But he replied, the vine dresser replied, pardon me, sir, let it alone. Pay attention to that phrase. Let it alone for 1 more year until I dig around it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good, but if not, you can cut it down. I want to make 3 points about this. Number 1, I think it is clear that the vine dresser is Jesus, because he's the only one who offers a reconciled, a healed tree, i.e. creation, to the Father.
Yeah.
Okay? This is why Jesus said, I was thinking about this today too. John 12:47, he said, I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. Judgment has been given to me by my Father, he says in John several times. But what does he do with the judgment? He takes it and reconciles. He digs around the tree. He does whatever it takes and offers that to the Father. Second thing. But he answered and said to the owner, sir, let it alone this year also until I dig around it and fertilize it. Why is that an interesting thing? Because the Greek word that is hard to translate, but you go to your Strongs, this is the word on let it alone, is aphiemi. It's not easy for me to say. Aphiemi. And it means let it be. I thought of the McCartney song.
I'd add it to the soundtrack, but we'd get taken down.
Yeah.
I can't pay those royalties.
Do you know how that song came to be?
No.
He was going through a time of great stress, middle of Beatlemania, right?
Yeah.
And he's just stressed and frustrated. And he had a dream, and his mother, clear as a bell, came to him. She died when he was 12. Her name was Mary. Mother Mary calls to me. And she said, son, just let it be.
That came from a dream.
Yep.
Wow.
Interesting. And here he says, let it be. Aphiemi means to let it alone, let it be, or forgive. Now we're back to the wheat and the tares, but we're not quite done. Luke uses the same word again. In chapter 23:34, when Jesus is on the cross and he says, Father, aphame, forgive them.
Wow.
The world lives under the reality of the forgiveness of God ever since the cross.
Yeah.
this isn't bad stuff, is it?
Man.
I could almost get to like parables. The third thing is...
Hold on 1 second. So I'm gonna push back a little bit, right?
Sure.
Because you've
Good.
got... you said
I
earlier
didn't know
that,
I was going to go down the McCartney Road, by the way.
Yeah, well, that was delightful. But earlier, you were talking about just being careful not to draw a direct analog between each character. We've talked about that before. And the owner, many commentators would claim that the owner who's trying to destroy the tree would be God. And Jesus is protecting us. As we said, Bradley has talked about Jesus is the asbestos suit to protect us from the white-hot rage of God.
And he's saying he isn't.
Indeed.
Just for our listeners.
Indeed. But looking at this second use of Ephiemi in Luke 23, where he's using it and saying it to God, is that not a reasonable conclusion then in terms of drawing that parallel between those two? Like if he's saying it to God himself in person on the cross, how do we justify that, or how do we square that circle coming back to this parable?
Keep going. Make your question clearer for me.
Jesus says it to God in real life on the cross.
Yes.
The character of the vine dresser says it to the vineyard owner in the parable.
Yeah.
Why can't we draw a parallel between those two things?
You can. All right, you can. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's where we should primarily go.
Yeah.
All right. The thing with parables, again, they're not nice and neat and balanced.
Yeah.
And I really believe that when Jesus is declaring that, he's not only giving us this great final example, it's the equivalent to John when he washes her feet, but he is declaring the eternal ultimate reality, which is forgiveness.
Yeah.
Okay. But when I just don't want to set up this juxtaposition between God and the Father, because I don't think it's there.
Yeah, the angry God who's trying to mete out his rage. Yeah.
So can I make a third point?
Yeah, I will allow it.
Thank you. He says, "Sir, let it alone, and let me work on it." He says, "Until I dig around it and put manure on it, and if it bears fruit, well and good." This is the other thing that we could consider today. Jesus is the vine dresser, but at another level, he's the fig tree, because he is the source of the Father's delight. We're back to pleasure. And this source willingly entered into the brokenness of humanity. He was willing to be dug into the earth. Who was created out of the earth?
That would be us.
That would be us. What we were formed from, he was willing, in the parable, of course, we're water to winey here. I just came up with a new term that I don't like very much. Maybe water to wine-ish. But now that I've spoiled the moment, that tells me something too. You know,
entering into
his willingness
our experience.
to enter into our brokenness and the whole thing.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes life craps on you.
Yeah.
Let me dig and put manure. There is no record in first century Palestine of them using manure to grow fig trees.
Really?
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
Wow.
I don't want to go down on a long road on manure, but okay, let's go quickly to the second issue I raised. What's the relationship between Luke's parable 13 and the Matthew Mark? In the morning, when Jesus returned to the city, he was hungry, and seeing a fig tree by the side of the road, he went to it and found nothing at all on it but leaves, and he said, "May no fruit ever come to you again." The fig tree withered at once. When the disciples saw it, they were amazed, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once? Truly, I tell you," and here's the classic, "if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, it will be done. Whatever you ask for in prayer with faith, you will receive. Now, I've taught more fully on this on the season of Matthew.
Yeah, this is Matthew 21, 18 through 20. I don't know what episode that is, but it'd be worthwhile looking
I
back
think
at
it's
our
around
archives.
40, 41. But that's a couple of years ago now.
Yeah.
It's also, I draw this out in my latest book, Pursuing the Mystery of Christ. So people can go deeper than I'm going to go. But I wanted to make a few small points.
Yeah.
Whereas for Luke, it was a story. For Matthew and Mark, it was a prophetic action. And in fact, in Matthew, it's the third prophetic action in a row, right? One right after the other. Triumphal entry, cleansing the temple, cursing of the fig tree. It is, for Matthew, it's a prophetic action. That's why these things build, that is pointing with great force toward the judgment that is coming upon Jerusalem. It's like Jesus is trying to shake them by the lapels. Yeah. Wake up.
When you say judgment coming to Jerusalem, are you talking AD 70?
Yes. Yeah, and we're going to get there too, but you're doing great. So the cursing of the fig tree was not a momentary act.
It's not just
of,
Jesus
of
getting
being
angry.
Irritated.
Yeah.
Right? And going all the way back to the beginning of the 2nd century, atheists use this example. There's nothing special about him. See, he just got ticked off like everybody else. That's not what it was. Just like his lament over Jerusalem, Jesus was speaking with deep sorrow. He saw clearly what was going to happen. For the next 5 chapters, we see a clear emphasis on the corporate, on the nation of Israel, much more than on the individual. He is shouting a warning for the nation because they're hanging on the precipice and they don't even know it. In that passage, there's this other interesting thing, which I've referred to somewhere in the past. He said, truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what's been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, it will be done, whatever you ask for. Okay, a couple of things. It's often generalized into the power of great faith in prayer. I'm all for great faith in prayer, in case anybody's nervous. And that's true, but it doesn't actually fit in with the context here. This was another warning about the judgment that was coming to Israel, which is represented by the temple that is on the Temple Mount, right? Yeah. So Jesus was saying, if you tear down this mountain, he says this mountain. So his crucifixion and his resurrection would inaugurate a new age, a whole new age. And part of that new age is that God's presence would no longer be found in the temple. It would now reside in the living temple of his bride, the church. So that's how you tearing down the Temple Mount. Yeah. Okay?
Yep.
Then number 3, if we look at this passage, I tell you the truth, if you have faith, do not doubt, not only will you do, and on and on. Every single one of the yous is plural. They're all yous, guys. Yeah. It speaks of the power of corporate prayer, the effectiveness of prayer in the community of believers. And in the context of prayer, we can not only be warned by this, but be encouraged. Yeah. Luke's parable is a time for corporate adjustment. This is a time, a warning that will cause us to change. But it does, this third meaning, call us into prayer. Yeah. Whatever yous guys pray. Yeah. Michael Green, the late Michael Green, he wrote this. If there is not fruit, he's talking about the church. If there is not fruit in prayerfulness, in evangelism, in love, and in ministry to the community, God will judge such churches and they will surely die, like the fig tree. Michael never was one for mincing words. I will get to the last thing.
Just before you do, not to derail you, but just one thing that I love when Scripture just some tiny little thing jumps out at you. I read this passage just I don't know 5 days ago in my reading and didn't notice this, but it just occurred to me today. This the reaction of his disciples when he curses the fig tree and it withers right away. It says, when the disciples saw it, they were amazed, saying, how did the fig tree wither at once? And on one level, my first reaction to that was, guys, how are you still amazed? Like, are you kidding me? You have walked around with this guy for 3 years and seen him do incredible wonders. I mean, calming the storm. Jesus can tell the storm literally to shut up, and it just stops.
And dead people can stand up.
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal. And, you know, he curses a fig tree, which is fairly interesting, I suppose. But, and they're amazed. And at first, what entered into me just a moment ago as we were reading that was almost a gentle rebuke of, come on, guys, how do you not know who this is yet? And they do know. They've already declared it. But at the same time, then I actually felt a conviction of, why on earth would you ever lose your sense of wonder at the Messiah, the one who can speak with such
positive.
Authority? Absolutely.
What are the exact words there?
It says, it just says, how did the fig tree? They were amazed.
They were amazed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so in modern vernacular, we're together, we're disciples, and we go, wow, did you see that?
Yeah, exactly. I don't ever actually want to lose that sense of wonder. And how dare I, feel silly about them still having that sense of wonder. How wonderful, how delightful it is that they can still just go, oh my goodness, that was amazing.
I love that. Wow. I feel kind of silly for saying vernacular. Okay. Just to wrap up, the final fig tree parable is very, very short. If anybody wants to make a note of it, it's Matthew 24, 32 and 33. It's Mark 13, 28 and 29. It's Luke 21, 29 and 30. The words are almost identical in all three. And this short warning comes immediately following Jesus' vivid and lengthy description of what is coming to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. If any of you are relatively new to this podcast, if you go to season 5, I think is Matthew, way down at around 39 or something, Brian Zahn gave us an hour that was
on Matthew 24.
Mind-boggling.
Yeah.
It's right after that when he's talking about this is what's coming. Mm-hmm. And it's so vivid. And, some people read that as he's predicting the end of the world, the end of the age, leading to the final judgment. I, like Brian, I long ago became convinced, no, he's talking about what's coming to Jerusalem when Rome comes. And he says, now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see these things, know that it is near at the door! ! It's coming. I feel like he's shouting, wake up, repent. You got to change the way you're living your life, the way you see, the way you perceive. There's a new reality has come. The kingdom is here. And if you don't, your sin will open the door to destruction. Yeah. That the devourer comes and does his work through Rome. So just to finish, we've got, you see quite a difference, don't you, between the Matthew, Mark, withering cursing the tree, and what Luke gives us. Mm-hmm. Though, as I said, I'm pretty convinced they're from the very same source. So it reminds us once again, we need both Luke and Matthew. Yeah. You got to have them both. Grace and the warning of consequential judgment, the divine consent. Yeah. So I think that's all that I really was prepared to say today.
I want to just, if we can dig in just a moment on this final warning of you got to stop, you got to change your ways, change the way you see the world around you, change the way you respond to the world around you. given the warning we've talked about today, it was as much about AD 70 as anything about this. Finally, Rome has had enough, and they come in and just you should go back and watch that Brian Zond episode, because we get a lot of details about what actually how absolutely horrific AD 70 really was. I mean, it was awful, hell on earth.
The Colosseum in Rome was built by slaves. From Jerusalem, and with the stones of the temple.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Oh, I missed that one.
Yeah.
Wow. When you talk about repent, what was the frame of mind that Jesus was in this particular case, in all of those passages you just referenced? What is he trying to warn them against? Because I think we need to figure out our context versus theirs, and how do we apply it to ourselves? Because I think it's not just like stop kicking the dog or yelling at your spouse. There's something more there. What is he warning him against?
That's a whole discussion, isn't it? Because I don't have an answer set, but he is warning us about deep things. The deep, at an individual level, the deep things of the heart. He is warning us about the idolatry of wanting. Whether you want stuff, you want a job, you want to be in charge, you want whatever. And what's the last thing that John says in 1 John? Beware of idols. Little children, beware of idols. Comes right out of, he's not talking about adultery, he finishes with that.
Yeah. So
at the personal level, it's changing, because otherwise, I was doing some reading on this last week. The idolatry leads and is connected with selfishness. And selfishness automatically pits me against you, even if it's nice and we love each other and we're smiling, because it is automatically competitive, because idolatry says, I want, right? I want. And so in Israel's context, first century Palestine, you have those who were willing to be corrupted, take bribes, bend the system, which always ultimately hurts the poor, and God always watches out for the poor. You had others, the zealots, who said, we're going to fight against those guys. And we're going to stand up against the system by, in those days, resistance, like the French resistance in the Second World War. I think he's saying you need to become the people. I'm back to Micah 6. You need, as a people, to love justice, which is the restoration of life.
And we come right back to that poem you read us today out of Isaiah. I came looking for justice and found something quite different. Found oppression instead.
So that's in super broad strokes.
Brilliant.
That's where I would be. It's quite a wonderful parable, isn't it?
Yeah. I am amazed. I confess I brought some trivia facts about figs because I wasn't sure how much there could be to say about a fig tree. I am surprised and delighted. We keep using that word today, but this was a lot of fun.
A little example of us beginning to think biblically, think water to wine, as opposed to thinking as children of the Enlightenment. Is the tree Israel? And we go, yeah, we just spent a long time saying it clearly is. But is the tree Jesus? Well, now that's a complete switch. Now the vine dresser's the tree. In our thinking, both can't be right. In biblical thinking, the answer is yes.
Oh, that's so important. Boy, oh boy, it's going to take a lifetime to get that.
Yeah, it is.
This has been
you got
so
more time
much
than I
fun
do, though.
today. Yeah, I do have more time, I think. We're not going there. This has been an absolute blast. As I say, I had no idea we could go so deep on one little tree. But wow, so much there. Folks, I hope you have enjoyed this episode of the Impact Nations podcast. I didn't even take time for an ad today, but hey, if you're wondering, if you're new here and you're wondering who the heck are these guys and what's this all about, head to impactnations.com. Check out a few stories. You know what? Go to the catalog, impactnations.com/catalog. We have stories on like every single page of lives rescued and restored, just radically transformed, rescuing people from terrible situations and seeing God's mercy and grace come and just wash over them and their situation completely turn around. You're going to enjoy those stories, and then join us. If that inspires you, if you want to take part in kingdom activity, make a gift in the catalog and watch and see what God does to rescue yet another life through you. We're here every Thursday. I don't even know what time this goes live anymore, but we're here Thursday. If you're watching, be on YouTube, subscribe, hit the bell so you get the notifications, see all the great videos that are coming out, including the podcast. And if you're listening, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Just look us up, Impact Nations Podcast, and you'll find us and subscribe. And we're here every single week, and we're talking parables. And I would encourage you, go back and listen to some of those ones from Matthew from a few years ago. Even if you did listen to them, so much stuff there that you can't retain at all. I'd forgotten that the stones of the Colosseum were taken right from the temple. That's amazing. Wow.
Do you think they were trying to make a point?
I think so, yeah. Unbelievable. All right, we're going to see you guys next week, next Thursday, and we're going to jump on. You got a teaser for us? What's the next parable? Do you know?
It's the next one. It's going to be good.
It's going to be good, folks. You heard it here first. It is the next one. We'll see you next week. God bless.
Bye-bye.